Hello and welcome to The Ukraine Shelf, a new podcast hosted by the UCL European Institute and produced in collaboration with UCL School of Slavonic and East European Studies and the Ukrainian Institute, London, and supported by the British Academy. My name is William Blacker. I'm an Associate Professor in Ukrainian and East European Culture at UCL, and alongside me in the studio is my co-presenter and co-creator of the podcast, Dr. Olesia Khromaychuk, author, historian and director of the Ukrainian Institute, London. Hello, Olesia.
Hello. In each episode, together with our guests, we'll seek out the best books about Ukraine that are already available in English and think about those that should be translated from Ukrainian and other languages. And we'll be adding these brilliant books to the Ukraine shelf, hoping that the shelf will also appear in our listeners' libraries.
And before we get to our first books and to our first amazing guests, a bit more about the idea for the podcast and the name The Ukraine Shelf and why we chose that name.
Yeah, so first of all, we chose it because we believe that books can expand our knowledge on Ukraine. So much needed, especially now that the country is fighting to protect its independence. Ukrainian authors and scholars of Ukraine have turned into fantastic ambassadors, and this podcast is our way to amplify their voices. But that thirst for knowledge is definitely there. Whenever I speak at literary festivals all over the world, I'm always asked to share recommendations for further reading on Ukraine. But the idea was also born out of a sense of frustration with the fact that whenever we go into bookshops in the UK or elsewhere in the world, you will find books dedicated to many different countries and nations, but very little on Ukraine. The situation, of course, has improved since 2022, but there's still a long way to go.
Yeah, and then we wonder why so many people in the West understand so little about Ukraine, and we wondered that in 2022. But you actually have your own special Ukraine shelf story, don't you?
I do. So I was visiting Paris in late 2023, so almost 2 years after the start of the full-scale invasion. And I went to one large bookstore to check out if they had a newly published French translation of my book, The Death of a Soldier, which is a book that I wrote about the death of my brother, Volodya, on the front line in Russia's war against Ukraine. And indeed, they did have that book, but it was shelved in the Russian literature section.
So a book about Ukraine, written by a Ukrainian in English, about Russia's war against Ukraine, but in the Russian section.
That's right. And to add insult to injury, when I pointed out the problem to the store manager, he was, let's say, less than helpful. In fact, he came up with a very telling explanation for the situation. He said that the section did not refer to Russia as a country, but more as a region.
A region. So basically treating everything that used to be under Russia's control for however many centuries as part of Russia, part of Russia's sphere of influence.
Yes, it would be more appropriate to call that section the Russian sphere of influence shelf, or perhaps the Russian imperialism shelf.
Indeed. Kind of shocking, but I think it really exemplifies why this idea of the Ukraine shelf is so important and why we have to focus on really building up that Ukraine shelf.
Precisely. If we are not making space in our bookshops and our libraries for Ukraine, there will be no space for it on our mental maps. And if the society, including its politicians, journalists, intellectuals, place the largest country within Europe in Russia's sphere of influence on their mental maps, it will have implications in real life. It will have implications for support and the level of understanding for Ukraine when Russia tries to redraw the actual map. And of course, we've seen this happening in this war.
Yeah, 100%. So with that in mind, maybe it's time to move on to our first book on the Ukraine shelf and our first guest on the podcast.
Yes, with great pleasure. We have with us today Elmaz Asan, who is a journalist at the Crimean Tatar media outlet ATR and currently a visiting research fellow at Cambridge, writing a PhD about British accounts of Russian colonization policies in Crimea after the annexation of 1783. Welcome, Elmaz.
Thank you so much for having me.
And we're also thrilled to have Rory Finnin with us. Rory is a professor of Ukrainian studies at the University of Cambridge, founder of the amazing Cambridge Ukrainian Studies program, a scholar of Ukrainian culture, and a prominent public commentator on all things Ukraine. And he's also the author of the excellent Blood of Others, Stalin's Crimean Atrocity, and the Poetics of Solidarity, which is published by University of Toronto Press in 2022 and is the book that we'll be speaking about today. Welcome, Rory.
Thank you very much. It's lovely to be here. Congratulations on this podcast.
Our first question, well, really, it's the question at the heart of the name of this podcast. What's been your experience seeking out this Ukraine shelf? And dare I say, the place for Crimea on this Ukraine shelf too. Have things changed over the last 3 years?
I would say that the full-scale invasion of Ukraine, February 2022, interest in Ukraine has noticeably increased. However, the war began much earlier with the annexation of my homeland, but unfortunately, that period was unnoticed. And overall, I believe there are lack of information, especially about Crimea and about Ukraine, and it's a big problem. And a few months ago, I went out on the streets of Cambridge and I simply asked passerby what they knew about Crimea. I recorded interview. And interestingly, most mentioned the Crimean War, Leo Tolstoy, Sevastopol stories. To my surprise, only one person mentioned about ethnic cleansing in Crimea and about Crimean Tatars, but in general, I would say there are lack information about the Crimea, and it's a big problem.
Yeah, so it's interesting. People's references were to kind of Russian history and Russian culture, first of all, when speaking about Crimea.
In general, yes. In general, they, but I would say they don't have any knowledges. If you speak about passerby, it was for me experience such what they knew about Crimea, but they mentioned only Crimean War, and they don't familiar with Crimea. But if we speak broadly about what people knew about Crimea, and when I met even people from academia, academic people, and I was very surprised with their questions about Crimea, about Crimean Tatars, and when they told me about it's not your homeland, but where is my homeland? it's and they told me about they referred more Russian narratives about Crimea, but there are lack of information about the statehood of the Crimean Tatars, Crimea Khanate time. Crimean Tatars, we have statehood which existed more than 300 years, which with rich intellectual heritage, philosophical thoughts, but people most focus on Russian majority, but they don't focus on the real history of the Crimea Peninsula.
Yes, that's very telling indeed. Rory, what about you? And of course, you've been instrumental in expanding the many shelves at Cambridge that contain Ukrainian books. How have things changed?
Thanks, Olesi, for the question. I think Elmaz is spot on with this paradox, because we've got an issue with the Ukraine shelf, which is still being, I think, expanded and is still evolving today. Obviously, a lot of the books are nonfiction. They're focused in particular on Russia's war of aggression against Ukraine. But then we have this issue of Crimea. And here, we encounter this paradox in which Crimea is present. Elmaz mentioned particularly British texts and histories about the Crimean War. But it's very rare for Crimea to be framed in relation to Ukraine at all. So we have this impoverished Ukraine shelf that's, I think, slowly but surely changing for the better. And then we have this shelf for books about Crimea that don't make much reference to Ukraine. And that's a problem we need to overcome.
On that note, it's probably a good moment to move on to your book, which is definitely doing exactly that, which is drawing attention to Crimea, but also Crimea as a part of Ukraine and a history of Crimea that's not told from the point of view of Russia or somehow from the point of view of, I don't know, the relationship between Britain and Russia somehow in the 19th century, but it's told from the point of view of Crimea. The book which I've already mentioned, is Blood of Others, Stalin's Crimean Atrocity and the Poetics of Solidarity. The focus of the book is the mass deportation of Crimean Tatars by the Soviet Union during World War II. But this is not a history of that event. It's a book which looks into the deeper history of Russian colonization of Crimea. It's about how Crimea occupies this crucial place in Crimean Tatar culture, in Ukrainian culture, indeed in Russian culture, in Russian imperial culture, and also in Turkish culture, which is really fascinating. The book deals with how the deportations were silenced, how knowledge about this was covered up, but also how that silence was broken by writers, dissidents, activists in the post-war years, people who really often risked their freedom, even their lives, to speak out about what happened. And I guess to come back a little bit to what we were talking about a moment ago, my first question about the book is why you, as a cultural historian of Ukraine, as a professor of Ukrainian studies, you start from Crimea. This is your first book, your magnum opus, and it's about Crimea. So tell us about the choice.
I've always been intrigued by this tension in studies of Crimea, in the way we frame Crimea within the Black Sea, within the story of Ukraine's history, and of course, within the context of the history of Russian colonialism. And what you find is normally that history of Russian colonialism is not prominent. The connection with Ukraine is tense but underexplored. A good example is in 2008 when the poet, rock performer, pro-stylist Serhiy Zhadan was sitting at a round table. This was before the invasion of Georgia. And he was sitting with a cultural activist named Ihor Sid, excuse me. And originally from Jankoy, a Russian figure who started something called the Krymsky Klub, the Crimean Club. And Sid asked Zhadan, are there writers who, in the Ukrainian tradition, focus and explore the question of Crimea, its role and its place in the story of Ukrainian culture, the relationships in particular with Crimean Tatar culture and Crimean Tatar history? And Zhadan couldn't offer any examples, and he speaks of this unwrittenness of Ukrainian literature vis-a-vis Crimea, this nepopropisanist is the word he uses. He mentions how Ukrainian writers looked at Crimea as a kind of tourist zone to which they came and went, but really not much more. And what was fascinating about that was, I recall in 2008, coming to Cambridge in particular, being very aware of the kinds of work local Ukrainian language cultural activists were doing with Crimean Tatar colleagues in Crimea. And it was as if they weren't seen at all. And I was intrigued by this from a lot of perspectives. I think Crimea, and like so much of Ukraine, it's the screen for so much disinformation, so much propaganda about Russian identity, the role of Russia in global geopolitics. Pound for pound, meter for meter, it is the place that's been subject most to disinformation, I think, in European world history. So looking at Crimea within a frame that we might identify as Ukrainian, taking something that Mikhail Hrushevsky called the Black Sea orientation was something that intrigued me. But it was also just an accident. I happened to come upon a lot of texts that referenced the deportation of the Crimean Tatars. I had a number of Crimean Tatar colleagues and friends that I met who were very intrigued by my use of the Ukrainian language. So these kinds of personal and professional factors played in to inspire me to take on this project.
Picking up on some of the things that Rory already said, let me turn to you, Elmaz. You've made your career explaining Crimea to very different audiences. What is the importance of Crimea for Ukraine, but also for the Black Sea region, historically and today?
Historically, Crimea, it's not Russian land, first of all. Never was and never will be. For Ukraine, it's very important territory, not only strategically, but historically as well. We have a lot of relationship during the Crimean Khanate time, and Ukrainian language has a lot of Turkic words, Crimean Tatar words, Turkic words, I would say. We have a lot of links, and therefore it's very important for both of us. And today we have a lot of opportunities to restore our history, our historical past, and create a new history about our relationship, because we together to do everything to liberate our homeland, our territories. Therefore, historically, Crimea it's also always related with Crimea, Ukraine with Crimea, and I would say about a relationship between Numanchely Bejihan, one of the leaders of the Crimean Tatars, with Grushevsky. We have a lot of literally relationship between our writers, translations, and so on. And I would mention Bogdan Khmelnytsky, who knows Crimean Tatar language. We have to restore it, and therefore it's very important globally, historically, and we have good chance before. We had good chance to be together, but Russia always interfere in our relationship, and it was a big problem. I have read about Numanchely Bejihan, how he asked Grushevsky about Crimean Tatar National Republic, and let's be together, but at the time Russia interfered for this relationship. But today we have a good chance to do everything to restore territorial integrity and our historical links, and I think we do every day good projects, and we gives high price our lives.
Indeed. You began your answer by sighing and saying first of all, it's not Russian land, and it never will be. And I could feel the tiredness of years or perhaps decades having to answer that question. But sadly, even well-meaning people, when we speak to them about Crimea, they tend to refer to this essentially Russian propaganda phrase that it's an ancient Russian land. This is a question to both of you. How would you, without turning it into a 2-hour lecture, explain to well-meaning listeners who perhaps still have that stereotypical view of Crimea? How do we explain it?
Well, maybe I can just quickly offer a statistic. This is not something that those of us in literary studies often do, but let's make the podcast, interdisciplinary. In the middle of the 19th century, the population of Crimea was 80% Crimean Tatar. So in the grand scheme of modern history, that's not so long ago. Within about 50 to 60 years after that point, the turn of the 20th century, they plummeted to 2025. So listeners should just simply ask themselves why. And what we see when we answer that question and try to confront it is a consistent attempt on the part of czars and, of course, Soviet authorities to expunge the Crimean Tatar people and the Krimchak and Karaim peoples of the peninsula from Crimea for a very simple reason, because their presence testified to the fact that Crimea is not Russian. And if you look closely at documents in the 20th century, Soviet authorities are very clear about this. After 1944, after Stalin deports the Crimean Tatars in a horrific act of ethnic cleansing and genocide, the Soviet authorities are very clear that they now need to, as they say, make a Crimea with its own Russian form, quote unquote. So they acknowledge that Crimea to this point didn't have a Russian form. And the fact that we sometimes think of it as Russian or in a Russian frame is simply the effect of a long period of time in which the West has succumbed and acquiesced to Russian propaganda. Because, frankly speaking, as an intellectual matter, it's harder to study different peoples, particularly those that don't map very well to certain typologies. The Crimean Tatars as Elmaz was just mentioning, in 1917, 1918, were launching and advancing the most progressive democratic government in the Muslim world to this point. The daughter of Ismail Gasparinsky, Shafika Gaspirali, was a major feminist who advanced women's rights and women's liberation many years before suffragettes in United Kingdom. We don't know about them, again, because in terms of knowledge production, they have been effaced. And they've been effaced for a very simple reason. The Crimean Tatars show us and remind us that Crimea has its own historical and cultural direction, and that the Russians have been trying to manufacture their own identity and presence there, and it's been violently done.
And what's also very important, that the name of Crimea, Krim, it's a Crimean Tatar name, it's Turkic name and translates fortress. It's not Russian name. It's also a very important point that Crimea, the name of Crimea of the peninsula, it's a Crimean, Turkic name, Crimean Tatar.
It's also, if we can jump in as well, just to amplify what Elmaz just mentioned, without the Crimean Tatars, there would likely be no modern Ukraine as we know it, because it's in the 17th century with this decisive alliance between the Ukrainian Cossacks and the Crimean Tatar Khan that the Cossacks win for themselves out of Polish-Lithuanian territory a hetmanate, a polity. So it's that alliance that makes possible the birth of a political Ukraine that has its own legs to stand on. So as Ukrainianists, or as people interested in Ukraine generally, we should be really aware of who the Crimean Tatars are. We should be really closely acquainted with their history and culture. And I was always fascinated by the fact that we were not. And I think that has a lot to do with the depth of this Russian imperialism that is cognitive, that invades the mind. And it's happened very frequently in the West, and still is a big problem.
Yeah, absolutely. And one of the things that come out of what both of you were saying is how, we have this, I guess in the West, we have this imagination of Crimea as being part of a Russian sphere of influence, and then we more or less, I think, understand that it's now part of Ukraine, but the whole Turkish connection is much less well understood, I think. And it's one of the things that is so interesting in the book, is how you trace the significance of Crimea in Turkish culture, Turkish literature, in the kind of pan-Turkic movement. Can you speak a bit to that dimension of Crimea, and also just as a fellow literary scholar who works in the kind of this field, the field of modern languages, so impressed by the use of so many languages in this. Crimean Tatar, Turkish, Ukrainian, Russian. It's something I also kind of wanted to ask you about, is the importance of languages, the importance of these different perspectives in studying Crimea, but also Ukraine more widely.
I was highly influenced by the work of William Blacker in this respect. I would simply say that the Turkish connection is hugely influential. It's very influential in the history of Ukraine writ large, and we have, in the case of Ukrainian studies, a lot of predecessors like Omelian Pritsak, who I think straddled these worlds. And I think if we want to understand the gravity of Russian colonialism over centuries and its impact not only on the histories and cultures of peoples like the Crimean Tatars, Ukrainians, Belarusians, etc., we really need to study this history, because so many peoples, Crimean Tatars are just one example, Circassians are another, as the Russian Empire expanded and committed acts of ethnic cleansing and genocide all the way to the Azov and Black Sea coasts, so many people from those parts of the world were displaced to Ottoman Turkey in the 19th century, and the legacy of their emigre communities have significance for us as scholars. So I really wanted to explore that connection. I also really wanted to begin to study the Crimean Tatar language and didn't have many outlets to do so, and I just began with Turkish. And that was a really significant impact in my life, a change in my life, to see suddenly how often Crimea and Ukraine were referenced in Turkish culture, and in particular how central the Crimean Tatars are to Turkey's sense of self, particularly in the 20th century. I mean, the figure of the Crimean Tatar victim, particularly after 1944, is very central to their experience in literature. So Elmaz and I were talking just earlier about the work of Cengiz Dağcı, for instance, who is a major author of the 20th century in the Turkish literary canon, a Crimean Tatar who was displaced during the Second World War, who's written a great deal about Soviet collectivization, etc. These are figures who straddle this world of thinking about Ukraine, living, in this case, in Dağcı's case, in Wimbledon, in the UK, but being very influential in the Turkish literary context. And I was fascinated once I began to see it, how deep this connection went.
Just to return to something you mentioned about Serhii Zhadan being asked about, the Ukrainian writers and their attitude towards Crimea. I feel like he should have read your book, because your book does have some really interesting examples of dialogue between Ukrainian writers and Crimean Tatar culture, Ukrainian writers looking at that culture in interesting ways in the context of Russian imperialism and the kind of common struggle against that imperialism. Writers like Lesy Ukrainka, for example, or Mikhailo Kotyubinsky, some of these classics of Ukrainian literature from late 19th, early 20th century were actually really thinking about these things. They were really aware of the close relationship between Crimea and Ukraine, about the fact that there is a kind of common struggle. There are certain parallels between the two cultures. Could you speak a bit more to some of those examples? Let's say if our listeners want to go and find those moments of literary solidarity, where should they look?
Elmaz mentioned them earlier, this deep connection that you do see between Crimean Tatar and Ukrainian cultures. I think if it's not been visible, I do believe that there's been intellectual work, a kind of intellectual power play that's made that connection hard for us to see. And you mentioned, William, classics. So I agree with you that the two that are probably most available to Ukrainians and those who are interested in Ukrainian history and culture are Lesy Ukrainka and Mikhailo Kotyubinsky. There are others we could discuss in the 20th century. Later in the 20th century, Roman Ivanichuk is a good example of someone who wrote a very popular novel that sought to explore Crimean history through the Crimean Tatar experience. And the fascinating thing, though, about these connections between Ukrainian and Crimean Tatar cultures is what they teach us more broadly about how to resist this cognitive colonialism. Lesy Ukrainka is a great example. She has a story that's been recently translated by Daisy Gibbons and supported by the Ukrainian Institute in London. And it's a story called At the Seaside, and it's a remarkable piece about a woman who's vacationing with a Muscovite debutante. And there are scenes in this story that feature what I call anti-colonial sightseeing, where by seeing how a Muscovite woman looks at a Crimean Tatar character in the story, the Ukrainian protagonist sees an image of herself and identifies not with the gaze of the Muscovite, but with the Crimean Tatar colonized. And that is a fascinating question. It gets to a lot of issues that we see in philosophy and scholarship on the psychopathology of colonialism. So if we read the works of Frantz Fanon or Homi Bhabha, Gayatri Spivak, the insights that they draw in this post-colonial context were things that Lesy Ukrainka decades before was gesturing to in her creative work. So these are really major works, classics that are becoming readily available that I had mentioned first.
Rory, would you agree that this dialogue rooted in solidarity is flourishing now? Or perhaps, Elmaz, you'd like to comment on that?
No, I can only add many Russians illegally live in my homeland, but how they wrote about Crimea, they haven't seen Crimean Tatars in comparison with Ukrainian writers. Rory mentioned them, Lesya Ukrainka, Kotsubinsky, Pід Minaretами, and it's very interesting. And as I think solidarity begins only now. I think we now started to learn each other. But before, it was very interesting how they wrote about Crimea, about Crimean Tatars. Chekhov, he lived in Crimea for many years, but he never mentioned about the Crimean Tatars. But Kotsubinsky, he wrote about Crimean Tatars, Lesya Ukrainka, and it's very interesting, the attitude towards Ukrainian, towards the Crimean Tatars.
It's changing a great deal, and the one thing we should understand is that the history of solidarity is long. Mm-hmm. In many respects, as I was trying to say earlier, it's progressive from an intellectual perspective. That is, a lot of these Ukrainian writers and Crimean Tatar writers were talking a great deal about the colonial gaze. They were addressing problems of the genderization of the colonized subject well before, I think, we in the Western European context were talking about these things. But now, I think, particularly after 2014, there has been a realization of just how deep this attempt to divide Ukrainians and Crimean Tatars from one another, how deep it went. And recognizing that depth, I think, has demanded various cultural activists and writers to explore the reasons why this disconnection occurred in the first place. And I think it's accelerated these bonds of solidarity. Obviously, it's highly complicated, and we shouldn't sugarcoat things and romanticize this relationship, because there are many stories that we can trace over centuries of antagonism between Crimean Tatars and Ukrainians. But in the 20th century, what you find is a really concerted effort, particularly among so-called dissidents or other thinkers, who really decided to identify and empathize in really personal ways with the Crimean Tatar experience without reducing it to something that they could appropriate. I think that, for us, is really fascinating to consider. And another work that we could mention here is a poem called Bakhchasarai, Cycle, or a Cycle, by Ivan Sokulsky, who is a young poet in Soviet Dnipropetrovsk, who visited Crimea like so many different writers in the 50s and 60s, and wrote about the experience of the deportation without reducing it to something that was comparable to a experience of Ukrainian dispossession or Ukrainian ethnic cleansing, but rather just focused on it alone and let the reader, through different intertextual connections, make the connection with the Ukrainian experience, but without doing it in a heavy-handed way that reduced the Crimean Tatar experience to kind of a tool that could be manipulated to serve Ukrainian interests. I've been very intrigued and inspired by the way in which a lot of these poets and artists avoided that reduction and that appropriation.
Yeah, well, I'd like to stick with this theme of dialogue and solidarity together with its ruptures and developments. Elmaz, just before we were talking, you said you've come back from Kyiv and how lovely it was. And one of the things that I noticed that you said was, there's so much Crimea there. And you had this big smile on your face. And that's what I want to ask you about. Maria Shinkarenko, Ukrainian scholar, wrote an article for the London Ukrainian Review titled Crimean Tatars' Story of Recognition. And there she analyzes Ukrainian state's strategy towards engaging with Crimean Tatars since the early days of independence, and often points out the lack of strategy. But she ends her piece on a rather hopeful note, and I'll quote a brief ending of that article. She says, Ukraine has done a lot of homework over the last 30 years to recognize the rights of its indigenous people. The combination of historical and legal arguments, along with today's unity against the common enemy, may offer a refreshingly open and positive vision of Crimea's future that is both Ukrainian and Crimean Tatar. Have we done our homework? What's left to do?
Oh, we have to do a lot of projects, but I went to Kiev and I was involved in different projects, and it was fascinating. I really met people. What inspired me, there are two departments of Crimean Tatar language in Kiev, and it still exists, these two departments, and Ukrainian people, they study Crimean Tatar language. It's very important. And even in our channel, we have Ukrainians who speak in Crimean Tatar fluently. And it's we dreamt about it, but today I think it's also our main task to speak in our both languages, and now we did it very well. And there are a lot of projects dedicated to Crimea, a lot of research, and Crimea studies will open soon in Kiev Mohila Academy, and there will be different lectures dedicated to Crimea, Crimean Tatar history, language. It's inspired me a lot. And now in our TV channel, we worked with many Ukrainians who began understand what's Crimea, and they accepted many Crimean Tatar traditions and their mentality now, and they are like part of our big Crimean Tatar family, and their contributions is amazing. And I would say they are now Crimean Tatar, and they know very well Crimean Tatar history, and even they can translate, they understand Crimean Tatar language. The process it's so good. It inspired me, and I believe one day everything will end with our victory. And every day we do our home task, and the full our accomplishment of what we're doing now in Kiev, and we will move it in Crimea, and we will continue to do it. I'm optimistic, to be honest, in Crimea issues, but there are people very pessimistic, but I believe everything will be fine, and we will restore our territorial integrity, and we will continue what we're doing every day in the UK, in Ukraine. We will continue to do it in Crimea.
We certainly share your optimism, for sure. Rory, let me zoom out a little bit. In your book, you say that reading stops bleeding. Do you believe that literature makes a difference in times of war?
Certainly, although I think our circumstances are changing all the time in this hyperactive, socially mediated information space we live in now. I worry a great deal that the kind of slowness that good literary reading involves is increasingly impossible in this kind of informational cognitive whirlwind we live in. But I do think that it's artists who allow us to see the world through fresh eyes. And I am encouraged, like Elmaz, with the synergies taking place between Ukrainian and Crimean Tatar artists who are challenging us to just think differently, not only about Ukraine, but about ourselves, about the past, about religious faith. I think there's a great deal that's going on that through culture will allow us to see a kind of victory in the future. It's a really hard journey and a hard road ahead, but there are groups out there that are doing amazing work and are taking very seriously the challenge of deoccupying not only Crimea, but our minds with respect to Crimea and our understanding of Crimea. It will take a long period of time, but we have a roadmap, and writers, musicians, visual artists, they help us visualize that roadmap, and I think absolutely culture makes a difference.
I mean, it is interesting that one of the trends in Ukrainian culture after 2014 has been the role of Crimean Tatars in it. So there are some really obvious examples, like Jamala, of course. This is probably in the world the most famous Ukrainian musician is Jamala, who speaks about Crimean history, in her music, very famously Eurovision, which she won with her song about 1944, focused on the same events as your book. But is able to do so in a way that's kind of, but she also uses Ukrainian language and Ukrainian music, and she's able to cross the two cultures, but also use jazz or whatever. Film directors, Nariman Aliyev's amazing film Homeward, which is very much about the loss of Crimea, and it's very much about the kind of axis, the kind of Kiev-Crimea axis, just precisely what Elmaz was talking about. That there is a Crimean Tatar community in Kiev which is displaced and dispossessed, and it's thinking about home. Akhtem Seytoblayev as well is another one, who's a Crimean Tatar director who's made films about Crimean Tatar history, again about the same events, about the war, but also about, he made a very famous blockbuster movie, Cyborgs, about the war against Russia. So it seems looking at that, it seems that ability to come together, to look at a common struggle, to look at common problems, to look at parallels in history, it's really something which is quite powerful in Ukraine today.
And just to take stock of what that means. I mean, we have a group, a nation of, at least in Crimea itself right now, anywhere between 200 to 300,000 people, thousands on the Ukrainian mainland, and all of them very centrally positioned culturally, politically. So politicians like Mustafa Jamilov, Rufat Chubarov, others are very well respected across the country. These individuals, culturally, politically, socially, are helping shape the Ukrainian project. And that should be a massive discovery for European readers, for all of us living in Britain and the United States and beyond. A Sunni Muslim people with a remarkable, diverse, progressive history are shaping the national identity of the largest country within Europe. That should be something that demands our attention. And for some reason, we've been slow to react to it. And it's happening now. And it's great that we're able to talk more about it because I think it requires so much more exciting study. And increasingly, I think, in the humanities, we're seeing great opportunities for undergraduate and postgraduate students to explore this kind of material. And it's great that we have colleagues in Ukraine. Elmaz mentioned Kyiv Mohila Academy and colleagues like not only Maria Shinkarenko, but also Martin Alexander Kisly and an entire team who have been driving this forward, and we're really grateful for their work because they've made so much possible.
We've spoken about the Crimean Tatars in Kiev, but of course there are Crimean Tatars in Crimea. And we spoke about this a little bit when we were chatting before the podcast, before the recording. Life is extremely tough for them in many ways under the occupation regime. All of these things we're talking about, this kind of cultural dialogue, these initiatives, these projects, Elmaz, do you feel like that gets through to people in Crimea, to Crimean Tatars in Crimea? Do they feel part of this process, or do they feel cut off from it? How do you see that?
For them, it's so difficult to be connected with all of us. But before the full-scale invasion, we had a huge impact, and we collaborate with them online. And many of Crimean Tatar elites, they participate online in Crimean Tatar channel, ATR, and we had a lot of projects. But today, after full-scale invasion, unfortunately, their life is so hard under everything, under Russian control, and it's impossible to do any collaboration. But people, they try to preserve language and national identity through cultural events. We have only weddings where we can preserve it. We don't have any platforms because there are total Russification. If we speak about Crimean Tatar language before the second annexation of Crimea, before the second Russian invasion, before the 2014, there were 16 Crimean Tatar schools. And what happened with this school? They turned into Russian school, and Crimean Tatar language is an optional language. And Ukrainian schools, they are shut down. Crimean Tatar channel ATR, and we it was accused in extremism, and we moved to Kiev. And there are a lot of problems with language, but people try to find different, like I mentioned about wedding or create some nursery, but it's everything, not everything is privately, and people try to do it at home. But there are people with still live with a big hope. Everything will end soon, and people try resist. And there are people quite strong, and Crimean Tatars, I would say, they are strong voice of Crimea, who really try to preserve their identity. And I would say my people very pro-Ukrainian and very pro-democratic.
And speaking about weddings, you told us something really interesting just before the recording, that after 2014 at Crimean Tatar weddings, they started to play more Ukrainian music.
Yes. When started full-scale invasion, it was like a resistance. In our wedding, we played Ukrainian music. But the consequences of Ukrainian music, it was so sad because the groom, bride, they were arrested. It was administrative arrest. They were arrested because of playing Ukrainian music in their weddings. It's only music. And but by for now, people, they can't play Ukrainian music because it can bring them for arrest, but it was kind of resistance. It was a huge resistance. Every wedding they played Ukrainian music.
Well, you were saying about schools being shut down brought back the memories from my childhood when I was, I think, 7, and I went to Crimea to greet the opening of the first Ukrainian language school.
Oh. Mm-hmm.
And I bet, I bet a few decades before that, there were people who wouldn't have envisaged that happening, but it happened. So now we have to believe, like you say, and stay optimistic that they will reopen, and new Crimean Tatar schools and Ukrainian language schools will reopen, and they will be filled with kids studying those languages and speaking them, for sure.
It's really difficult in this context to talk about life under occupation, and Elmaz has been extremely vocal and taught us a great deal about the way Crimean Tatars in particular, just by being agentful in their own culture and identity, are under threat. But it's also really clear when we look at documentation that the Russian government provides, how many in Crimea are indeed resisting. So there have been changes to the criminal code to offer penalties and punishments for people who have so-called discredited the Russian army, Russian military. And we can see these court cases ourselves, and you can see thousands of cases since the full-scale invasion of people being brought to court for precisely these things, of playing Ukrainian music, Ukrainian folk songs in a host of different contexts, putting something on Facebook. You can see the resistance and you can quantify it. It's not something that is hidden in the way that we often think it is. And so we need to be present to just how frequent this resistance is. We can't ignore it, and we certainly shouldn't think that the opportunities for that resistance to exercise its own energy and power is something we should look past and forget about.
I think we could keep talking for a long time about the Ukrainian Crimean solidarity, about all these amazing cultural moments of cultural dialogue and cultural togetherness and unity. We have to draw to a close. Before we do that, though, we want to come back to our Ukraine shelf. We have one book on the Ukraine shelf already, which is Rory's fantastic Blood of Others, which deals with all the questions that we've been discussing in this podcast. But we need some more books. So I'd like to ask you guys for your recommendations for the Ukraine shelf. What would you add?
I would recommend to read Rory books. Thank you so much for your contribution to the Crimean Tatar history and for our country, for Ukraine. Rory's books, Blood of Others, Stalin, Crimea, Atrocity, and Poetics of Solidarity. And we need to translate a lot of books, and one of them recently published by the Ukrainian journalist and writer Anastasia Levkova, "За перекопом є земля." And I would be very happy that the Crimean Tatar books Rory mentioned about Cengiz Dagci. He's a famous and outstanding Crimean Tatar novelist. He wrote about Crimea, and he lived in 50 years in London, and he couldn't return Crimea, and he lived in London, and he wrote about real Crimea before the deportation. It's his novels must be translated. I think it's very important, and I think it's important to tell about Crimean Tatar intellectual heritage, like Crimean Tatar philosophical thoughts, because for people Crimea is so-called Russian land, but Crimea is the land of the Crimean Tatars, and we have our rich intellectual heritage. And Ukrainian an Orientalist researcher, he published an amazing book about Crimean Tatars' philosophical thoughts, about the very well-known Crimean Tatar philosophers who were well-known beyond of Crimea. And Mikhail Yakubovich, he wrote this book.
I would agree completely with Elmaz's suggestion about Anastasia Levkova's brilliant books, Perekopom ya Zemlya. There is Land Beyond Perekop, which is a reference to the Isthmus of Perekop that connects the Crimean Peninsula to mainland Ukraine, particularly to the southern steppe. That has been, in part, an excerpt has been translated by our wonderful colleagues and published in the London Ukrainian Review. So everyone should run to read a snippet of that, and then to encourage everyone who has the capacity to read Ukrainian and to translate to finish the rest of the book, because it is one of the, I think, best books I've read. I'm biased, but the best books I've read in the Ukrainian language for 20 years. I would also mention, in addition to Cengiz Dagci, also Shamil Aliadin, who needs to be translated into English because he is a fascinating Soviet-era writer who has 3 texts in particular that are key to understanding not only the Crimean Tatar historical experience, but Ukraine and the Ukrainian alliance. He, like Dagci, was someone who was displaced after 1944 in particular. He fought in the Red Army, but nonetheless he returned from the front to find that his family had been deported, Fatma and Dilara. And he discovered them, came upon them, and eventually wrote about this experience in a piece that is called I Am Your God and Your Tsar. Really important work to read, to understand the depths of the evils of Russian colonialism. And I'm using that term evil very consciously. I know it's not an academic term, but it's one we can, I think, freely use in this context and should use more. And he also wrote remarkable works in the Crimean Tatar language that give us this fictionalized 19th century of the Crimean Tatar Khanate, a work called Iblisinin Ziyafeta Nadavet, the Devil's Invitation to the Feast, which follows the protagonist, Toktar Gazi, one of the major cultural figures of the 19th century, as he moves from Bakhchisarai to Karovsu Bazar, all these places in Crimean Tatar Crimea. It really is a rich prose work. And he also wrote a work that was incomplete, but about the Crimean Tatar-Ukrainian alliance, a work that actually features the Cossack hetman Bogdan Khmelnytsky swearing an allegiance with the Crimean Tatar Khan in the Ukrainian language, placing his hand on the Quran as well. So it's a remarkable scene. These are works that tell us a great deal about Ukraine and Crimea and should be on the Ukraine shelf for sure.
Amazing. Thank you so much. So, yeah, thank you so much, guys, for making this first episode of the Ukraine Shelf such a rich and fascinating discussion. We're so grateful for your wisdom, for your insights, and also for your recommendations.
And we really hope that our listeners have enjoyed our conversation and are rushing to order that new shelf that they're going to fill with all these fantastic new books on Ukraine. Thank you.
Before we finish, please spread the word about the podcast if you've enjoyed it, and keep an eye out for future episodes. And most importantly, keep reading about Ukraine.